Hello, hope you're all doing well. Want to spend some time talking about food sovereignty and anti-colonial resistance. We're in a little bit of a catch up from last week, so we'll be finishing this up today and then also looking at boarding schools and education issues later this week. So in terms of food sovereignty, um, just want to have a working definition. Sovereignty, we've gone over a little bit in terms of what it means in relation to manifest destiny and treaty and land rights. But sovereignty is generally defined, political, legal sovereignty is generally defined as your right to make laws that impact your people and your territory. However, cultural sovereignty is much broader, and food sovereignty fits within cultural sovereignty. And as defined here, this is the international definition. It's the right of people to be healthy and right of people to have access to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So food sovereignty has been impacted, obviously, through colonialism. One of our tribal educators, Mia Maruko, who's Pomo, she has a line. She says, "Kill the food, kill the culture." And when you look, especially at other cultures that immigrate to America, they often bring their food with them. It's typically what we know about other groups of people is being introduced to their food. But Native people have really had to fight to be able to get their food. There's a variety of issues around why they've had to fight to do so. Major issue is loss of land. If we don't have land to tend and grow our foods on and have access to harvest, we don't have access to those foods. So there's a lot of environmental impacts of colonization. When we looked at the mission system, they talked a lot about the stock animals that were brought and how those ruined the agricultural gardens that Native people had because the animals would eat things, and pull them out by their roots. Another issue we see during the gold rush was the methods and the environmental degradation. Hydraulic mining, mercury that was used in Lay's Latin in the lakes and the streams. Those types of things that either washed away hillsides or killed plants and animals through toxicity. The fact that California Indians were landless for 50 years. And when the Rancheria Act was enacted in 1905, there really wasn't large tracts of land that were bought for families to live on where they could tend and create agricultural systems. Assimilation efforts really to, Henry Pratt said, kill the Indian but save the man, and he meant kill the Indian culturally, erase everything in terms of cultural knowledge from the children, religion, language, and knowledge of traditional practices and cultural resources. And with that came a commodity food program, which is a federal program that basically, today it's, I suppose, SNAP-Ed. And SNAP-Ed is really working on creating healthy resources for communities. But it's to overcome a long period of when, cheap foods were given to communities in need. And those included, cheese, processed cheese, and flour and sugar, and fried bread that you typically see at Indian events. Well, that was the best thing that we could do was with lard and flour, and it's tasty. It's not a native traditional food. It's a colonial food. And as a result of that, there are a lot of issues with diet-related diseases, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, epigenetics we've talked about before with historical trauma that often turns DNA sequences on towards different diseases. And then there's also environmental impacts. A lot of what we're seeing with wildfires today are results of a 100-year ban on controlled burning, which was how Native people tended the landscape in California. Because of that, the undergrowth of the oak savannas have a lot of fuel, and typically those areas were burned once a year at least, and the burning also brings more nutrients. The burnings also help certain trees germinate. So the redwood trees, they don't germinate unless they reach really high temperatures, which are the controlled burns facilitate that. So there's a lot of benefits to controlled burning in indigenous fire ecology that haven't been able to be performed. So the environment hasn't seen the benefits of that in the last century. At the museum where I work at, we do a lot of work around food sovereignty, and it's led by our tribal youth, and it's a means of really creating resilience and resistance to the colonial context. Not only do we not have access to lands, Sonoma, Mendocino, Lake County, we have some tribes, but we have very small land bases. And much of the land, the agriculture has turned from cattle farming to grape vineyards. And those create a lot of problems for our cultural resources, largely in terms of pesticides and different things that contaminate it. And so we started doing some work back in 2016, and we really just started out wanting to identify healthy traditional food sources and have a conversation within our community about what the gaps were in order to be able to access those foods. So we did interviews, we did an assessment, and we got about 65% of our community members who attributed health issues in our community to a lack of access to healthy and traditional foods. Since then, we've also done green energy and infrastructure, native resilient generations project that really looks at environmental stewardship, and food sovereignty was also prioritized in those assessments as a way of combating not just colonialism, but climate change. So our youth started what was called a youth participatory action research, and they came up with a question and then researched it within our community. So they asked, what are your ideas for incorporating traditional foods into our daily lives? And what we found were that we were accessing traditional foods, but really only at special events, and that we would be healthier if we could find ways to combine kind of modern recipes and processes with our traditional foods and cultural resources. We started creating resources for the community that kind of flipped some of the typical resources out there. We created an Indian food pyramid that really kind of minimizes people's grain intake and focuses more on proteins and vegetables. We started creating resources around what a pomo plate would look like in terms of the different components of foods that we should be eating every day. And the staple food throughout California and much of the West Coast is acorns. Acorns, there's a lot of different variety of acorns. Each tribes up in the north really like tan oak. In our region, we like the black oak. And they're kind of a superior source of protein. And they're, people, this is acorn time right now. People are walking on them all the time. So they're typically, in a lot of our opinions, going to waste when they can be gathered, dried, stored, cracked, and processed into flour and made into healthy different recipes. These are some other examples of our traditional foods. We started researching different foods that especially around the time of the pandemic and the fires, different foods that served benefited your respiratory system that could be made into teas. So we started looking at different things like nettle and elderberry and wild rose, things that could be made and given to our community members and elders during that time. We also started looking at the bay laurel and pepper nuts, which kind of can be made into something that's more like an espresso bean. Gives you a little energy. You shouldn't eat too much of it. It has other consequences. Also looking at manzanita. Manzanita is a natural sweetener, can also be made as a sugar substitute to sweeten coffee and other things. Seaweed has a lot of health benefits. Abalone is something that's also traditional, but it's can't be harvested for several years. It hasn't been able to, and probably be several more because of the warming of the ocean. Abalone, many of them are starving because they don't have the plankton and things that they need, and so they don't grow big enough to be harvested. Looking at other traditional ways of cooking, similar if you've ever been to Hawaii and seen an underground pig roast. Deer is roasted similarly here in Northern California in that way. Lots of different vegetables that can be harvested, and so there's a variety of foods. Huckleberries, there's different tubers and roots that are really healthy. So we're working on creating more recipes. Quail is another protein that we use and make into a stew. We've been combining things, chia. We made an acorn miso, so we've been combining some of the traditional ingredients into more modern recipes, which makes it fun and interesting. Our kids spent several years just working with local cultural advocates and elders and going around and learning recipes, attending pre-colonial feasts, working with chefs. They developed a product with Chef Crystal Wapapa, who's a Kickapoo chef, but she has Pomo children, so she was very interested in Pomo foods. Also working with Cafe Aloni, Vincent Medina, and Luis Trevino, who have done a lot of work in food sovereignty in the Oakland region in the Bay Area, and they're opening a new restaurant on the UC Berkeley campus. And then just going out and sharing what they learned with the community, documenting plant identification, going out and harvesting and learning different methods, learning to store these foods, how to process these foods, using different things, commercial food processors and dehydrators and different things that kind of modernize the process and are time-saving techniques that they've learned. So it's been a really great experience because everybody loves to come together around food. In terms of our community, we asked them questions about their harvesting practices, if they were out there doing traditional food harvests and what were their challenges to that. So we see about 34% of our community who is actively engaged, and the majority are not. Looked at what types of foods they gather, why they thought food sovereignty was important, definitely for nutritional health, but also keeping cultural traditions alive, and the importance of gathering, not just for the food you ingest, but also the physical activity involved in gathering has a lot of benefits, as well as the communal activity of bringing people together to harvest and prepare food and share stories and and create cultural revitalization opportunities. All right, looks like it didn't cut me off at 15 minutes, so I'm going to keep going. The themes in the community responses were that traditional foods are foods that are eaten by our ancestors, that we should seek out knowledge and incorporate them into our everyday lives. The importance of having reciprocity with the environment, that we shouldn't just be taking from the environment, but we should be offering something back in terms of prayers or nutrients that show gratitude. That there's a lot of barriers to traditional food harvesting, some in terms of having the knowledge, being able to identify the plants, making sure you're not getting poisonous plants or plants that'll make you sick, but also that it takes a lot of time, and with kind of our busy lives today between work and sports and other events, people don't always have the time it takes to commit to traditional food harvesting and processing. But that traditional food is really critical, important for our well-being. Communities members said that we need to teach and educate our younger generations, that we need to create more community gardens so families have access and alternatives, that food should be looked at as medicine, that diabetes is a huge problem in our community, and a lot of people are sick or die from complications from diabetes, that we need to teach our kids how to gather and prepare food, that we need to have educational lessons around food, that we need to encourage kids to do it at an early age, and that we need to incorporate language and speaking around our traditional food teachings, and that our tribal governments need to make food a priority because it's a public health issue, as well as a cultural revitalization issue, and I think now really critical as a climate change issue. There were a lot of challenges identified around food sovereignty, the transmission of knowledge, being able to engage with people who can share and demonstrate that knowledge, which also became an issue during the pandemic because everything needed to go virtual. So we started having virtual plant identification walks and things like that, and it took us a little time to get up to speed. The affordability. So acorn flour, if you buy it, it's about $30 a pound, and that's because it's very labor intensive. And so we know that the more labor intensive things are, the more that they're going to have to cost when they reach the market. So having to figure out how we can decrease the affordability or subsidize those activities. Control in regards to land is another issue. Land, having access, buying land where we can harvest, creating MOUs or different legal agreements with folks who are private landowners. Also, permitting is an issue. To be able to gather on public land, you really need to have a permit that's usually only good for about a 24-hour window. So not just navigating each agency's permitting policies, but being able to forecast the right 24 hours when you can gather is very difficult now because climate change often pushes things further out than we're normally used to. Competition. We live in a foodie area. It's the wine country. It's Pomo country, but it's the wine country. And we see, things like abalone and some of the other foods going into kind of the high-end food market, and it creates competition for us. We know that there are eligibility issues for subsidized food assistance because we live in an area where a lot of people earn higher incomes. However, housing is very high here. So even if you earn a higher income, it doesn't mean that you have more money in your pocket to spend on food and necessities for your family. Climate change is creating the wildfires that have happened almost every year, hopefully not this year, in our region have created issues for food gathering. The smoke and kind of the blackout that we see happen for weeks at a time um, ruins acorns sometimes, makes them kind of black and mushy, and they're not able to be dried and processed. We also see toxic runoff from the fires, the wildfires that have burned lots of neighborhoods. So in those areas, we can't gather around those neighborhoods because we don't know the consequences of that. And really getting our tribal leaders to adopt agricultural and food sovereignty policies. A lot of times people are really focused on economic development, and those are short term. We need this for this, rather than really having a long term vision and seeing, hey, if we start doing this now, maybe our kids will have fewer incidences of diabetes in 20 years or 30 years. So things like that, um, trying to move those up the political agenda. Some strategies for change are making sure that we're increasing knowledge within the community, that we're working with cultural educators to document, create videos, create more access for our folks, that we're increasing affordability, creating a marketplace where Native vendors can compete, or even, a marketplace where trade can be conducted versus having to go to a farmer's market where you have to pay a percentage to the farmers market group in order to be able to show your foods there. Using modern technology to reduce the time it takes to gather and process. Increasing our control over healthy food resources. Increasing access to privatized land. We're really looking at purchasing land where we can really manage the oaks 24/7. Creating agreements, MOUs, memorandums of understanding with not only local private landowners, but also working within state parks and county parks and different agencies so that they can see how those permitting processes need to be revised. And creating online sales and highlighting native food vendors so that people have more access. Doing more industry education. We were really trying to get a label for one of our products, and because it's acorn flour based, acorn is not in the FDA labeling system, so they don't know what to do with it. So working with them to educate about this ancestral food ingredient. Trying to be able to be more proactive and have more of a voice in how climate change is mitigated, making sure that Indigenous food stewardship is part of that. Doing outreach to food programs, trying to get traditional foods in schools, creating committees with local food advocates, educating tribal leadership. Lots of work to be done. So we're always busy. And then revitalization strategy is really increasing access and the transmission of knowledge, engaging our community, getting them excited about learning about food, documenting and learning, and then really just consistent work with our cultural educators on, once or twice, 3 times a month, making sure that information is consistently flowing out to our community is how we keep people engaged and excited. And then we've created some different resources at the museum. So one of our resources is an acorn protein bar. We call them acorn bites. And we created that project, which is acorn flour based, but it also has blueberries and pine nuts and chestnuts and other traditional foods, and it's very healthy. So we sell that online. That's our traditional food product. We also work with our local tribal farmers and distribute food boxes. to community members, and we're planning on creating a food hub where we can have more native food vendors come in, market food, but also have shared um, equipment so that the community can harvest food and reduce the costs and time it takes to gather and harvest food, and have the capacity to store it for them. So the food hub is a collective kind of based institution, but as well as an educating based institution. So we'll have a teaching kitchen as well. So we're planning that now and excited to see that come to fruition. So that gives you kind of an overview of the food sovereignty work that we do here. And then you'll watch a video called Gather, which is in the links. And that'll give you kind of an overview of what communities are doing around Indian country with food sovereignty. So take a look at that, and I will talk to you Thursday about education and boarding schools.